Hello, Cardinals, and welcome to our next installment of Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake 8. So yummy. Yummie and Crake graduated from Healthwiser High on a warm, humid day in early February. The ceremony used to take place in June. The weather then used to be sunny and moderate, but June was now the wet season all the way up the East Coast, and you couldn't have held an outdoor event then, what with the thunderstorms. Even early February was pushing it. They'd ducked a twister by only one day. Healthwiser High liked to do things in the old style with marquees and awnings and the mothers in flowered hats and the fathers in Panamas and fruit-flavored punch with or without alcohol and Happicuppa coffee and little plastic tubs of So Yummy ice cream, a Healthwiser own brand, in chocolate soy, mango soy, and roasted dandelion green tea soy. It was a festive scene. Crake was the top of his class. The bidding for him by rival edu-compounds at the student auction was brisk, and he was snatched up at a high price by the Watson Crick Institute. Once a student there, and your future was assured. It was like going to Harvard had been, back before it got drowned. Yummie, on the other hand, was a mid-range student, high on his word scores, but a poor average in the numbers columns. Even those underwhelming math marks had been achieved with the help of Crake, who'd coached Yummie weekends, taking time away from his own preparations. Not that he himself needed any extra cramming. He was some sort of mutant. He could crank out the differential equations in his sleep. "Why are you doing this?" Yummie asked in the middle of one exasperating session. "You need to look at it differently. You have to get the beauty of it. It's like chess. Here, try this. See? See the pattern? Now it all comes clear." But Yummie did not see, and it did not come all clear. "Why help me out?" "Because I'm a sadist," Crake said. "I like to watch you suffer." "Anyway, I appreciate it," said Yummie. He did appreciate it for several reasons, the best being that because Crake was known to be tutoring him, Yummie's dad had no grounds for nagging. If Yummie had been from a module school, or better, from one of those dump bins they still called the public system, he'd have shone like a diamond in a drain. But the compound schools were awash with brilliant genes, none of which he'd inherited from his geeky, cack-hearted parents, so his talent shrank by comparison. Nor had he been given any extra points for being funny. He was less funny now, anyway. He'd lost interest in the general audience. After a humiliating wait while the brainiacs were tussled over by the best edu-compounds and the transcripts of the mediocre were fingered and skimmed and had coffee spilled on them and got dropped on the floor by mistake, Yummie was knocked down at last to the Martha Graham Academy. And even that only after a long spell of lackluster bidding. Not to mention some arm-twisting Yummie suspected on the part of his dad, who'd known the Martha Graham president from their long-defunct mutual summer camp and probably had the dirt on him, shagging smaller boys, dabbling in black market pharmaceuticals, or, this was Yummie's suspicion, in view of all the ill grace and excessive force with which his hand was shaken. "Welcome to Martha Graham, son," said the president with a fake smile as a vitamin supplement salesman's. When can I stop being a son? Thought Yummie. Not yet. Oh, not yet. "Attaboy, Yummie," said his father at the garden party afterwards, giving him the arm punch. He had chocolate soy goo on his dweeby tie, which had a pattern of pigs with wings. "Just don't hug me," Yummie prayed. "Honey, we're so proud of you," said Ramona, who'd come decked out like a whore's lampshade in an outfit with low neckline and pink frills. Yummie had seen something like that on Hot Tots once, only it was worn by an 8-year-old. Ramona's push-up bra breast tops were freckled from too much sun. Not that Yummie was much interested in those anymore. He was familiar with the tectonics of cantilevered mammary gland support devices by now, and anyway, he found Ramona's new matronly air repellent. She was getting little creases on either side of her mouth, despite the collagen injections. Her biological clock was ticking, as she was fond of pointing out. Pretty soon it would be the new skin's Botoxique treatment for her. Wrinkles paralyzed forever, employees half price. Plus, in say 5 years, the Fountain of Youth total plunge, which rasped off your entire epidermis. She kissed him beside the nose, leaving a smooch of cerise lipstick. He could feel it resting on his cheek like bicycle grease. She was allowed to say "we" and to kiss him because she was now officially his stepmother. His real mother had been divorced from his father in absentia for desertion, and the bogus wedding of his father had been celebrated, if that was the word for it, soon after. Not that his real mother would have given a wombat's anus, thought Jimmy. She wouldn't have cared. She was off having cutting-edge adventures on her own, far from the Dolores festivities. He hadn't had a postcard from her in months. The last one had shown a Komodo dragon and had borne a Malaysian stamp and had prompted another visit from the Corsicore. At the wedding, Jimmy got as drunk as it took. He propped himself against a wall, grinning stupidly at the happy couple, cut the sugary cake, all real ingredients as Ramona had made known. Lots of cackling over the fresh eggs. Any minute now, Ramona would be planning a baby, a more satisfactory baby than Jimmy had ever been to anybody. Who cares? Who cares? He'd whispered to himself. He didn't want to have a father anyway, or be a father, or have a son, or be one. He wanted to be himself, alone, unique, self-created, and self-sufficient. From now on, he was going to be fancy-free, doing whatever he liked, picking globes of ripe life off of the life trees, taking a bite or two, sucking out the juice, and throwing away the rinds. It was Crake who'd gotten him back to his room. By that time, Jimmy had been morose and barely ambulatory. "Sleep it off," said Crake in his genial fashion. "I'll call you in the morning." Now here was Crake at the graduation garden party, looming up out of the crowd, shining with achievement. No, he wasn't, Snowman amends. Give him credit for that, at least. He was never a triumphalist. "Congratulations," Jimmy made himself say. It was easier because he was the only one at this gathering who'd known Crake well for any length of time. Uncle Pete was in attendance, but he didn't count. Also, he was staying as far away from Crake as possible. Maybe he'd finally figured out who'd been running up his internet bill. As for Crake's mother, she'd died the month before. It was an accident, or so went the story. Nobody liked to say the word sabotage, which was notoriously bad for business. She must have cut herself up at the hospital. Although, said Crake, her job didn't involve scalpels, or scratched herself, or maybe she'd been careless and had taken her latex gloves off and had been touched on a raw spot by some patient who was a carrier. It was possible. She was a nail biter. She might have had what they called an integumental entry point. In any case, she'd picked up a hot bioform that had chewed through her like a solar mower. It was a transgenic staph, said some lab coat, mixed with a clever gene from the slime mold family, but by the time they'd pinned it down and started what they hoped would be effective treatment, she was in isolation and losing shape rapidly. Crake couldn't go in to see her, of course. Nobody could. Everything in there was done with robotic arms, as in nuclear materials procedures, but he could watch her through the observation window. It was impressive, Crake told Jimmy. Froth was coming out. Froth? Ever put salt on a slug? Jimmy said he hadn't. Okay, so like when you brush your teeth. His mother was supposed to be able to speak her last words to him via the mic system, said Crake, but there was a digital failure so that he could see her lips moving, but he couldn't hear what she was saying. Otherwise put, just like daily life, said Crake. He said anyway he hadn't missed much because by that stage she'd been incoherent. Jimmy didn't understand how he could be so nil about it. It was horrible. The thought of Crake watching his own mother dissolve like that. He himself wouldn't have been able to do it, but probably it was just an act. It was Crake preserving his dignity because the alternative would have been losing it. Happicuppa. For the vacation following graduation, Jimmy was invited to the Musoni Healthwiser gated vacation community on the western shore of the Hudson's Bay, where the top brass of Healthwiser went to beat the heat. Uncle Pete had a nice place there, nice place being his term. Actually, it was like a combination mausoleum and dirty weekend hideaway. A lot of stonework, king-size magic finger bed, bidets in every bathroom, though it was hard to imagine Uncle Pete getting up to anything of much interest in there. Jimmy had been invited, he was pretty sure, so that Uncle Pete wouldn't have to be alone with Crake. Uncle Pete spent most of his time on the golf course and the rest of it in the hot tub, and Jimmy and Crake were free to do whatever they liked. They probably would have gone back to interactives and state-sponsored snuff and porn as relaxation after their final exams, but that was the summer the Gen Mod Coffee Wars got underway, so they watched those instead. The wars were over the new Happicuppa bean, developed by a Healthwiser subsidiary. Until then, the individual coffee beans on each bush had ripened at different times and needed to be hand-picked and processed and shipped in small quantities. But the Happicuppa coffee bush was designed so that all of its beans would ripen simultaneously, and coffee could be grown on huge plantations and harvested with machines. This threw the small growers out of business and reduced both them and their laborers to starvation-level poverty. The resistance movement was global. Riots broke out, crops were burned, Happicuppa cafes were looted. Happicuppa personnel were car bombed or kidnapped or shot by snipers or beaten to death by mobs. And on the other side, peasants were massacred by the army, or by the armies, various armies. A number of countries were involved. But the soldiers and dead peasants all looked much the same wherever they were. They looked dusty. It was amazing how much dust got stirred up in the course of such events. Those guys should be whacked, said Crake. Which ones, the peasants or the guys killing them? The latter, not because of the dead peasants. There's always been dead peasants. But they're nuking the cloud forest to plant this stuff. The peasants would do that too if they had half a chance, said Yummie. Sure, but they don't have half a chance. You're taking sides. There aren't any sides as such. Nothing much to be said to that. Yummie thought about shouting bogus, decided it might not apply. Anyway, they used up that word. Let's change channels, he said. But there was Happicuppa coverage, it seemed, wherever you turned. There were protests and demonstrations with tear gas and shooting and bludgeoning. Then more protests, more demonstrations, more tear gas, more shooting, more bludgeonings. And this went on day after day. There hadn't been anything like it since the first decade of the century. Crake said it was history in the making. Don't drink death, said the posters. Union dock workers in Australia, where they still had unions, refused to unload Happicuppa cargoes. In the United States, a Boston coffee party sprang up. There was a staged media event, boring because there was no violence, only balding guys with retro tattoos or white patches where they'd been taken off, and severe-looking baggy-boobed women, and quite a few overweight or spindly members of marginal, earnest religious groups in T-shirts with smiley-faced angels flying with birds, or Jesus holding hands with a peasant, or God is green on the front. They were filmed dumping Happicuppa products into the harbor, but none of the boxes sank, so there was the Happicuppa logo, lots of copies of it, bobbing around on the screen. It could have been a commercial. Makes me thirsty, said Yummie. Shit for brains, said Crake. They forgot to add rocks. As a rule, they watched the unfolding events on the nudie news via the net, but for a change, they sometimes watched fully clothed newscasters on the wall-sized plasma screen in Uncle Pete's leatherette-upholstered TV room. The suits and shirts ties seemed bizarre to Yummie, especially if he was mildly stoned. It was weird to imagine what all those serious talking heads would look like, minus their fashion items, full frontal on the nudie news. Uncle Pete sometimes watched, too, in the evenings when he was back from the golf course. He'd pour himself a drink and then provide a running commentary. The usual uproar, he said. They'll get tired of it. They'll settle down. Everybody wants a cheaper cup of coffee. You can't fight that. No, you can't, Crake would say agreeably. Uncle Pete had a chunk of Happicuppa stock in his portfolio, and not just a little chunk. What a mort, Crake would say as he scanned Uncle Pete's holdings on his computer. You could trade his stuff, said Yummie, sell the Happicuppa, buy something he really hates, buy wind power. No, better, buy a croaker, get him some South American cattle futures. Nah, said Crake, I can't risk that with the labyrinth. He'd notice. He'd find out I've been getting in. Things escalated after a cell of crazed anti-Happicuppa fanatics bombed the Lincoln Memorial, killing 5 visiting Japanese school kids that were part of a tour of democracy. Stop the hypocrisy, read a note left at a safe distance. That's pathetic, said Yummie. They can't even spell. They made their point, though, said Crake. I hope they fry, said Uncle Pete. Yummie didn't answer because now they were looking at a blockade at the Happicuppa head office compound in Maryland. And there, in the shouting crowd, clutching a sign that read, "A happy cup is a crappy cup," with a green bandana over her nose and mouth wasn't it? His vanished mother. And for a moment, the bandana slipped down and Yummie saw her clearly. Her frowning eyebrows, her candid blue eyes, her determined mouth. Love jolted through him, abrupt and painful, followed by anger. It was like being kicked. He must have let out a gasp, and then there was a Corsicore charge and a cloud of tear gas and a smattering of what sounded like gunfire. And when Jimmie looked again, his mother had disappeared. "Freeze the frame," he said. "Turn back." He wanted to be sure. How could she be taking such a risk? If they got a hold of her, she'd really disappear, this time forever. But after a brief glance at him, Crake had already switched to another channel. I shouldn't have said anything, thought Jimmie. I shouldn't have called attention. He was cold with fear now. What if Uncle Pete made the connection and phoned the corpsman? They'd be right on her trail. She'd be roadkill. But Uncle Pete didn't seem to have noticed. He was pouring himself another scotch. They should spray gun the whole bunch of them, he said, once they've smashed those cameras. Who took that footage anyways? Sometimes you wonder who's running this show. "So what was that about?" said Crake when they were alone. "Nothing," said Jimmie. "I did freeze it," said Crake. "I got the whole sequence." "I think you better erase it," said Jimmie. He was past being frightened. He'd entered full-blown dejection. Surely at this very moment Uncle Pete was turning on his cell phone and punching in the numbers. Hours from now it would be the Corsicore interrogation all over again. His mother this, his mother that. He would just have to go through it. "It's okay," said Crake, which Jimmie took to mean, "You can trust me," and then he said, "Let me guess, phylum Chordata, class Vertebrata, order Mammalia, family Primates, genus Homo species sapiens sapiens, subspecies, your mother." "Big points," said Jimmie listlessly. "Not a stretch," said Crake. "I spotted her right away, those blue eyes. It was either her or a clone." If Crake had recognized her, who else might have done so? Everyone in the Healthwiser compound had doubtless been shown pictures. "You've seen this woman?" The story of his deviant mother had followed Jimmie around like an unwanted dog and was probably half responsible for his poor showing at the student auction. He wasn't dependable. He was a security risk. He had a taint. "My dad was the same," said Crake. "He buggered off too." "I thought he died," said Jimmie. That's all he ever got out of Crake before. Dad died, full stop, changed the subject. It wasn't anything Crake would talk about. "That's what I mean. He went off a Cleveland overpass. It was rush hour, so by the time that they got to him, he was cat food." "Did he jump or what?" said Jimmie. Crake didn't seem too worked up about it, so he felt it was okay to ask that. "It was the general opinion," said Crake. "He was a top researcher over at Healthwiser West, so he got a really nice funeral. The tact was amazing. Nobody used the word suicide. They said, 'Your father's accident.'" "Sorry about that," said Jimmie. "Uncle Pete was over at our place all the time. My mother said he was really supportive." Crake said supportive like a quote. "She said besides being my dad's boss and best friend, he was turning out to be a really good friend of the family. Not that I've ever seen him around much before. He wanted things to be resolved for us. He said he was anxious about that. He kept trying to have these heart-to-heart talks with me, telling me about how my father had problems." "Meaning your dad was a nut bar," said Jimmie. Crake looked at Jimmie out of his slanty green eyes. "Yeah, but he wasn't. He was acting worried lately, but he didn't have problems. He had nothing like that on his mind, nothing like jumping. I'd have known." "You think maybe he fell off?" "Fell off. Off the overpass." Jimmie wanted to ask what he'd been doing on a Cleveland overpass in the first place, but it didn't seem like the right time. "Was there a railing?" "He was kind of uncoordinated," said Crake, smiling in an odd way. "He didn't always watch where he was going. He was head in the clouds. He believed in contributing to the improvement of the human lot." "You get along with him?" Crake paused. "He taught me to play chess before it happened." "Well, I guess not after," said Jimmie, trying to lighten things up, because by this time he was feeling sorry for Crake, and he didn't like that at all. "How could I have missed it?" Snowman thinks. "What was he telling me? How could I have been so stupid?" No, not stupid. He can't describe himself the way he'd been. Not unmarked. Events had marked him. He'd had his own scars, his own dark emotions. Ignorant, perhaps, unformed, incoherent. There'd been something willed about it, though, his ignorance, or not willed exactly, structured. He'd grown up in walled spaces, and then he had become one. He had shut things out. Applied rhetoric. At the end of the vacation, Crake went off to Watson Crick and Jimmie to Martha Graham. They shook hands at the bullet train station. "See you around," said Jimmie. "We'll email," said Crake. And then noticing Jimmie's dejection, he said, "Come on, you did okay. The place is famous." "Was famous," said Jimmie. "It won't be that bad." Crake was wrong for once. Martha Graham was falling apart. It was surrounded, Jimmie observed as the train pulled in, by the tackiest kind of plebeians. Vacant warehouses, burnt-out tenements, empty parking lots. Here and there were sheds and huts put together from scavenged materials. Sheets of tin, slabs of plywood, inhabited no doubt by squatters. How did such people exist? Jimmie had no idea. Yet there they were, on the other side of the razor wire. A couple of them raised their middle fingers at the train, shouted something that the bulletproof glass shut out. The security at Martha Graham Gateway was a joke. The guards were half asleep. The walls, scrawled all over with faded graffiti, could have been scaled by a one-legged dwarf. Inside them, the Bilbao rip-off cast concrete buildings leaked. The lawns were mud, either baked or liquid, depending on the season, and there was no recreational facilities apart from a swimming pool that looked and smelled like a giant sardine can. Half the time, the air conditioning in the dorms didn't work, and there was a brownout problem with the electrical supply. The food in the cafeteria was mostly beige and looked like recunk shit. There were arthropods in the bedrooms, families, and genera various, but half of them were cockroaches. Jimmie found the place depressing, as did, it seemed, everyone there with any more neural capacity than a tulip. But this was the hand life had dealt him, as his dad had said during their awkward goodbye, and now Jimmie would just have to play it as well as he could. "Right, Dad," Jimmie had thought. "I always known I could count on you for really, really sage advice." The Martha Graham Academy was named after some gory old dance goddess of the 20th century who'd apparently mowed quite a swath in her day. There was a gruesome statue of her in front of the administration building, and her role, said the bronze plaque, as Judith, cutting off the head of a guy in a historical robe outfit called Holofernes. Retro feminist shit was the general student opinion. Every once in a while, the statue got its tits decorated or steel wool glued onto its pubic region. Jimmie himself had done some of the gluing. And so comatose was the management that the ornaments often stayed up there for months before they were noticed. Parents were always objecting to this statue. "Poor role model," they'd say. "Too aggressive, too bloodthirsty, blah, blah." Whereupon the students would rally to its defense. Old Martha was their mascot, they'd say. The scowl, the dripping head and all. She represented life or art or something. Hands off, Martha. Leave her alone. The academy had been set up by a clutch of now-dead rich liberal bleeding hearts from old New York as an arts and humanities college at some time in the last third of the 20th century, with special emphasis on the performing arts, acting, singing, dancing, and so forth. To that had been added filmmaking in the 1980s and video arts after that. These things were still taught at Martha Graham. They still put on plays, and it was there Jimmie saw Macbeth in the flesh and reflected that Anna Kay and her website for Peeping Toms had done a more convincing job of Lady Macbeth while sitting on her toilet. The students of song and dance continued to sing and dance, though the energy had gone out of these activities and the classes were small. Live performance had suffered in the sabotage panics of the early 21st century. No one during those decades had wanted to form part of a large group at a public event in the dark, easily destructible walled space, and no one with any cool or status. Theatrical events had dwindled into versions of the sing-along or the tomato bombardment or the wet t-shirt contest, and though various older forms had dragged on, the TV sitcom, the rock video, their audience was ancient and their appeal mostly nostalgic. So a lot of what went on at Martha Graham was like studying Latin or bookbinding, pleasant to contemplate in its way, but no longer central to anything, though every once in a while the college president would subject them to some yawner about the vital arts and their irresistible reserved seat in the big red velvet amphitheater of the beating human heart. As for filmmaking and video arts, who needed them? Anyone with a computer could splice together whatever they wanted or digitally alter old material or create new animation. You could download one of the standard core plots and add whatever faces you chose and whatever bodies too. Jimmy himself had put together a naked Pride and Prejudice and a naked To the Lighthouse, just for laughs. And in sophomore Viz Arts at Healthwiser, he'd done the Maltese Falcon with costumes by Kate Greenaway and depth and shadow styling by Rembrandt. That one had been good. A dark tonality, great chiaroscuro. With this kind of attrition going on, the erosion of the former intellectual territory, Martha Graham had found itself without a very convincing package to offer. As the initial funders had died off and the enthusiasm of the dedicated artsy money had waned and endowment had been sought in more down-to-earth quarters, the curricular emphasis had switched to other arenas. Contemporary arenas, they were called. Web game dynamics, for instance. Money could still be made from that, or image presentation, listed in the calendar as a sub-branch of pictorial and plastic arts. With a degree in PicPlarts, as the students called it, you could go into advertising, no sweat, or problematics. Problematics was for word people, so that was what Jimmy took. Spin and Grin was the nickname among the students. Like everything at Martha Graham, it had utilitarian aims. Our students graduate with employable skills ran the motto underneath the original Latin motto, which was Ars Longa, Vita Brevis. Jimmy had few illusions. He knew what sort of thing would be open to him when he came out on the other end of problematics with his risible degree. Window dressing was what he'd be doing at best, decorating the cold, hard numerical real world in flossy 2D verbiage. Depending on how well he did in his problematics courses, applied logic, applied rhetoric, medical ethics and terminology, applied semantics, relativistics, and advanced mischaracterization, comparative cultural psychology, and the rest, he'd have a choice between well-paid window dressing for a big corp or flimsy cut rate stuff for a borderline one. The prospect of his future life stretched out before him like a sentence. Not a prison sentence, but a long-winded sentence with a lot of unnecessary subordinate clauses, as he was soon in the habit of quipping during happy hour pickup time at the local campus bars and pubs. He couldn't say he was looking forward to it this rest of his life. Nevertheless, he dug himself in at Martha Graham as if into a trench and hunkered down for the duration. He shared a dorm suite, one cramped room either side, silverfish-ridden bathroom in the middle, with a fundamentalist vegan called Bernice, who had stringy hair held back with a wooden clip in the shape of a toucan and wore a succession of God Gardener's t-shirts, which, due to her aversion to chemical compounds such as underarm deodorants, stank even when freshly laundered. Bernice let him know how much she disapproved of his carnivorous ways by kidnapping his leather sandals and incinerating them on the lawn. When he protested that they hadn't been real leather, she'd said they'd been posing as it and as such deserved their fate. After he'd had a few girls up to his room, none of Bernice's business, and they'd been quiet enough, apart from some pharmaceutically induced giggling and a lot of understandable moans, she'd manifested her views on consensual sex by making a bonfire of all of Jimmy's jockey shorts. He'd complained about that to Student Services, and after a few tries, Student Services at Martha Graham was notoriously grumpy, staffed as it was by burnt-out TV series actors who could not forgive the world for their plunge from marginal fame. He got himself moved to a single room. First my sandals and then my underwear. Next it'll be me. The woman is a pyromaniac. Let me rephrase that. She's reality challenged in a major way. You wish to see the concrete evidence of her crotch-wear auto-da-fe? Look into this tiny envelope. If you see me next in an urn, gritty ashes, couple of teeth, you want that responsibility? Hey, I'm a student here, and you're the service. Here it is, right in the letterhead C. I've emailed this to the president. That's not what he actually said, of course. He knew better than that. He smiled. He presented himself as a reasonable human being. He enlisted their sympathy. After that, after he got his new room, things were a little better. At least he was free to pursue his social life unhampered. He had discovered that he projected a form of melancholy attractive to a certain kind of woman, the semi-artistic, wise wound kind, in large supply at Martha Graham. Generous, caring, idealistic women. Snowman thinks of them now. They had a few scars of their own. They were working on healing. At first, Jimmy would rush to their aid. He was tender-hearted, he'd been told, and nothing if not chivalrous. He'd drawn out of them their stories of hurt. He'd apply himself to them like a poultice. But soon the process would reverse, and Jimmy would switch from bandager to bandagee. These women would begin to see how fractured he was, and they'd want to help him gain perspective on life and access the positive aspects of his own spirituality. They saw him as a creative project, the raw material, Jimmy in his present gloomy form, the end product, a happy Jimmy. Jimmy let them labor away on him. It cheered them up. It made them feel useful. It was touching, the lengths to which they would go. Would this make him happy? Would this? Well then, how about this? But he took care never to get any less melancholy on a permanent basis. If he were to do that, they'd expect a reward of some sort, or a result at least. They'd demand a next step and then a pledge, but why would he be stupid enough to give up his gray rainy day allure, the crepuscular essence, the foggy aureole that had attracted them in the first place? I'm a lost cause, he would tell them. I'm emotionally dyslexic. He would also tell them that they were beautiful and they turned him on. True enough, no falsehood there. He always meant it. He would also say that any major investment on their part would be wasted on him. He was an emotional landfill site, and they should just enjoy the here and now. Sooner or later, they'd complain that he refused to take things seriously. This, after having begun by saying he needed to lighten up. When their energy flagged at last and the weeping began, he'd tell them that he loved them. He took care to do this in a hopeless voice. Being loved by him was a poison pill. It was spiritually toxic. It would drag them down in the murky depths where he himself was imprisoned, and it was because he loved them so much that he wanted them out of harm's way, i.e. out of his ruinous life. Some of them saw through it. Grow up, Jimmy. But on the whole, how potent that was. He was always sad when they decamped. He disliked the part where they get mad at him. He was upset by any woman's anger. But once they'd lost their temper with him, he'd known that it was over. He hated being dumped, even though he himself had maneuvered the event into place. But another woman with intriguing vulnerabilities would happen along shortly. It was a time of simple abundance. He wasn't lying, though, not all the time. He really did love these women, sort of. He really did want to make them feel better. It was just that he had a short attention span. You scoundrel, says Snowman out loud. It's a fine word, scoundrel. One of the golden oldies. They knew about his scandalous mother, of course, these women. Ill winds blow far and find a ready welcome. Snowman's ashamed to remember how he'd used that story. A hint here, a hesitation there. Soon the women would be consoling him, and he'd roll around in their sympathy, soak in it, massage himself with it. It was a whole spa experience in itself. But then his mother had attained the status of a mythical being, something that transcended the human, with dark wings and eyes that burned like justice and a sword. When he got to the part where she'd stolen Killer the Rakunk away from him, he could usually wring out a tear or two, not from himself, but from his auditors. What did you do? Eyes wide, single pat of hand on arm, sympathetic glaze. Oh, you know. Shrug, look away, change subject. It wasn't all acting. Only Oryx had not been impressed by this dire, feathered mother of his. So, Jimmy, your mother went somewhere else. Too bad. Maybe she had some good reasons. You thought of that? Oryx had neither pity for him nor self-pity. She was not unfeeling, on the contrary, but she refused to feel what he wanted her to feel. Was that the hook? That he could never get from her what the others had given him so freely? Was that her secret? Asperger's you. Crake and Jimmy kept in touch by email. Jimmy whined about Martha Graham in what he hoped was an entertaining way, applying unusual and disparaging adjectives to his professors and fellow students. He described the diet of recycled botulism and salmonella, sent lists of the different multi-legged creatures he'd found in his room, moaned about the inferior quality of the mood-altering substances for sale in the dismal student mall. Out of self-protection, he concealed the intricacies of his sex life, except for what he considered the minimum of hints. These babes may not be able to count to 10, but hey, who needs numeracy in the sack? Just as long as they think it's 10. Ha ha, joke. He couldn't help boasting a little because this seemed to be, from any indication he'd had so far, the one field of endeavor in which he had any of the edge over Crake. At Healthwiser, Crake hadn't been what you'd call sexually active. Girls had found him intimidating. True, he'd attracted a couple of obsessives who thought he could walk on water, and who'd follow him around and send him slushy, fervent emails and threaten to slit their wrists on his behalf. Perhaps he even slept with them on occasion, but he'd never gone out of his way. Falling in love, although it resulted in altered body chemistry and was therefore real, was a hormonally induced delusional state, according to him. In addition, it was humiliating because it put you at a disadvantage. It gave the love object too much power. As for sex per se, it lacked both challenge and novelty, and was on the whole a deeply imperfect solution to the problem of intergenerational genetic transfer. The girls Jimmy accumulated had found Crake more than a little creepy, and it had made Jimmy feel superior to come to his defense. He's okay, he's just on another planet, was what he used to say. But how to know about Crake's present circumstances? Crake divulged few factoids about himself. Did he have a roommate, a girlfriend? He never mentioned either, but that meant nothing. His email descriptions were of the campus facilities, which were awesome, and Aladdin's treasure trove of bioresearch gizmos, and of, well, what else? What did Crake have to say in his terse initial communications from the Watson Crick Institute? Snowman can't remember. They'd played long, drawn-out games of chess, though, 2 moves a day. Jimmy was better at chess by now. It was easier without Crake's distracting presence, and the way he had of drumming his fingers and humming to himself as if he already saw 30 moves ahead and was patiently waiting for Jimmy's tortoise-like mind to trundle up to the next rook sacrifice. Also, Jimmy could look up grandmasters and famous games of the past on various net programs in between moves. Not that Crake wasn't doing the same thing. After 5 or 6 months, Crake loosened up a bit. He was having to work harder than at Healthwiser High, he wrote, because there was a lot more competition. Watson Crick was known to the students there as Asperger's U because of the high percentage of brilliant weirdos that strolled and hopped and lurched through its corridors. Demi-autistic, generally speaking, single-track tunnel vision minds, a marked degree of social ineptitude. These were not your sharp dressers. And luckily for everyone there, a high tolerance for mildly deviant public behavior. More than at Healthwiser, asked Jimmy. Compared to this place, Healthwiser was a plebe-land, Crake replied. It was wall-to-wall NTs. NTs? Neurotypicals. Meaning minus the genius gene. So, are you a neurotypical? Jimmy asked the next week, having had some time to think this over, also to worry about whether he himself was a neurotypical, and if so, was that now bad in the gestalt of Crake? He suspected he was, and that it was. But Crake never answered that one. This was his way. When there was a question he didn't want to address, he acted as if it hadn't been asked. You should come and see this joint, he told Jimmy in late October of their sophomore year. Give yourself a life experience. I'll pretend you're my dull, normal cousin. Come for Thanksgiving week. The alternative for Jimmy was turkey with the parental unit turkeys. Joke. Ha ha, said Jimmy. And he wasn't up for that, so it'd be his pleasure to accept. He told himself he was being a pal and doing Crake a favor. For who did lone Crake have to visit with on his holidays, aside from his boring old Australopithecine, not really an Uncle Pete? But also he found he was missing Crake. Hadn't seen him now for more than a year. He wondered if Crake had changed. Jimmy had a couple of term papers to finish before the holidays. He could have bought them off the net, of course. Martha Graham was notoriously lax about scorekeeping, and plagiarism was a cottage industry there. But he'd taken a position on that. He'd write his own papers, eccentric though it seemed, a line that played well with the Martha Graham type of woman. They liked a dash of originality and risk-taking and intellectual rigor. For the same reason he'd taken to spending hours in the more obscure regions of the library stacks, ferreting out arcane lore. Better libraries at institutions with more money had long ago burned their actual books and kept everything on CD-ROM, but Martha Graham was behind the times in that, as is everything. Wearing a nose cone filter to protect against the mildew, Jimmy grazed among the shelves of moldering paper, dipping in at random. Part of what impelled him was stubbornness, resentment even. The system had filed him among the rejects, and what he was studying was considered, at the decision-making levels, the levels of real power, an archaic waste of time. Well, then, he would pursue the superfluous as an end in itself. He would be its champion, its defender and preserver. Who was it who'd said that all art was completely useless? Jimmy couldn't recall, but hooray for him, whoever he was. The more obsolete a book was, the more eagerly Jimmy would add it to his inner collection. He compiled lists of old words, too, words of a precision and suggestiveness that no longer had a meaningful application in today's world, or Toadie's world, as Jimmy sometimes deliberately misspelled it on his term papers. Typo, the profs would note, which showed how alert they were. He memorized these hoary locutions, tossed them left-handed into conversations. Wheelwright, lodestone, saturnine, adamant. He'd developed a strangely tender feeling towards such words, as if they were children abandoned in the woods, and it was his duty to rescue them. One of his term papers for his applied rhetoric course was titled Self-Help Books of the 20th Century, Exploiting Hope and Fear, and it supplied him with great stand-up routine for use in the student pubs. He'd quote snatches of this and that. Improve your self-image, the 12-step plan for assisted suicide, how to make friends and influence people, flat abs in 5 weeks. You can have it all. Entertaining without a maid, grief management for dummies. And the circle around him would crack up. He now had a circle around him again. He'd rediscovered that pleasure. Oh, Jimmy, do cosmetic surgery for everyone. Do access your inner child. Do total womanhood. Do raising nutria for fun and profit. Do the survival handbook of dating and sex. And Jimmy, the ever-ready song and dance man, would oblige. Sometimes he'd make up books that didn't exist. Healing diverticulitis through chanting and prayer was one of his best creations. And nobody would spot the imposture. He'd turned that paper topic into his senior dissertation later. He'd gotten an A. There's a bullet train connection between Martha Graham and Watson Crick with only one change. Jimmy spent a lot of the 3-hour trip looking out of the window at the pleblands they were passing through. Rows of dingy houses, apartment buildings with tiny balconies, laundry strung on the railings, factories with smoke coming out of the chimneys, gravel pits, a huge pile of garbage next to what he supposed was a high-heat incinerator, a shopping mall like the ones at Healthwiser, only there were cars in the parking lots instead of electric golf carts, a neon strip with bars and girly joints, and what looked like an archaeological-grade movie theater. He glimpsed a couple of trailer parks and wondered what it was like to live in one of them. Just thinking about it made him slightly dizzy as he imagined a desert might or the sea. Everything in the plebland seemed so boundless, so porous, so penetrable, so wide open, so subject to chance. Accepted wisdom in the compound said that nothing of interest went on in the pleblands apart from buying and selling. There was no life of the mind. Buying and selling, plus a lot of criminal activity, but to Jimmy it looked mysterious and exciting over there on the other side of the safety barriers. Also dangerous. He wouldn't know the ways to do things there. He wouldn't know how to behave. He wouldn't even know how to pick up girls. They'd turn him upside down in no time. They'd shake his head loose. They'd laugh at him. He'd be fodder. The security going into Watson Crick was very thorough, unlike the sloppy charade that took place at Martha Graham. The fear must have been that some fanatic would sneak in and blow up the best minds of the generation, thus dealing a crippling blow to something or other. There were dozens of Corsicore men, complete with spray guns and rubber clubs. They had Watson Crick insignia, but you could tell who they really were. They took Jimmy's iris imprint and ran it through the system, and then 2 surly weightlifters pulled him aside for questioning. As soon as it happened, he guessed why. "You seen your runaway mother lately?" "No," he said truthfully. "Heard from her? Had a phone call, another postcard?" So they were still tracking his snail mail. All the postcards must be stored on their computers, plus his present whereabouts, which is why they hadn't asked where he'd come from. "No," again, he said. They had him hooked up to the neural and pulse monitors, so they knew he wasn't lying. They must also have known that the question distressed him. He was on the verge of saying, "And if I had, I wouldn't tell you, ape face," but he was old enough by then to realize that nothing would be served by that, and it was likely to land him on the next bullet train back to Martha Graham or worse. Know what she's been doing, who she's hanging out with? Jimmy didn't, but he had a feeling that they themselves might have some idea. They didn't mention the Happicuppa demonstration in Maryland, though, so maybe they were less informed than he feared. "Why are you here, son?" Now they were bored. The important part was over. "I'm visiting an old friend for Thanksgiving week," said Jimmy. "A friend from Healthwiser High. He's a student here. I've been invited." He gave the name and the visitor authorization number supplied to him by Crake. "What sort of a student? What's he taking?" "Transgenics," Jimmy told them. They pulled up the file to check, frowned at it, looked moderately impressed, and then they made a cell call as if they hadn't quite believed him. What was a serf like him doing visiting the nobility, their manner implied. But finally they let him through, and there was Crake in his no-name dark clothing, looking older and thinner and also smarter than ever, leaning on the exit barrier and grinning. "Hi there, corknut," said Crake, and nostalgia swept through Jimmy like sudden hunger. He was so pleased to see Crake that he almost wept.